Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Global Equiano, the Early Caribbean Society's virtual, global, and free event. I'm speaking to you here at the University of Winnipeg, which sits on the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Métis, and Oji Cree nations. The University of Winnipeg sits in Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral and traditional homeland of Anishinaabe peoples. Treaty 1, signed in 1871, took this territory from 7 local Anishinaabe First Nations in order to make the land available for settler use. Following the Manitoba Act of 1870, as well as the 1885 resistance by Métis, Cree, and Assiniboine peoples, and continuing now into the present day, Indigenous lands and waters, both life-giving and sacred, to First Nations and Métis peoples have been appropriated, intruded upon, irreparably altered, damaged, and polluted through numerous acts of imperialist and settler violence and aggression. The catastrophic result of this has been a dislocation from the land and ways of life that has destroyed or threatened the well-being of the original occupants of the land and their descendants. In acknowledging this, the Early Caribbean Society commits to honouring and supporting movements of self-determination and well-being, led by Indigenous guardians, stewards and protectors of this land and of the lands from which we all speak. Ultimately, we commit to work for land back, which the Yellowhammer Institute describes this way. Land back is about reclaiming Indigenous jurisdiction, breathing life into rights and responsibilities. In this virtual global event, many of us are speaking and participating from colonised lands, where Indigenous peoples have been subjected to genocide, ethnic cleansing, forced removal from the African continent to Turtle Island and beyond. We acknowledge that these genocides are ongoing and that Indigenous peoples continue to be removed from their lands and brutalised by the carceral state. Across Turtle Island, but also globally, policing, starvation and deprivation remain systematic tools of settler colonialism. We acknowledge the material benefits that accrue to us as scholars, writers and artists from the dispossession of others. In this virtual world, dispossession is absolutely just as material. The very materials that power our technologies are extracted via new forms of slavery, child slavery and genocide, as we see in the Democratic Republic of Congo and elsewhere. The cables and networks that connect us are also extensions of neo-colonial power and more frequently are being used in the same way as borders to exclude and police. The very corporations that own the technologies we are using are often direct contributors to war, dispossession, and genocide. Within this context, this event is very much a celebration of the kinds of spaces we might be able to make, even within these overwhelming contexts. This is an open access, a free global event that crosses borders, does not require visas or money to attend, and we want this to be understood as a deliberate intention of the format. It breaks the model of traditional conferences by offering listening spaces, salons, and conversations. It's very much inspired by the 20th anniversary celebration to Dion Brand's incredible book, A Map to the Door of No Return. When that played, it set a model for a new type of gathering possible in these virtual worlds. Thanks and acknowledgements come next. I want to thank my collaborators sitting here beside me, Alex Milsom, Kate Singer, and Désha Osborne, including the past president, Professor Cassandra Smith. A lot of work has gone on behind the background. We are a very small and not at all funded society, and we've pretty much done all of this by ourselves and on a shoestring. Alex Milsom in particular has done a lot of the labour required by the technology, and she's done the editing, the uploading, the managing of Zoom and YouTube, a lot of things that really aren't seen but are just vital to this, and her expertise and her production skills are greatly appreciated. Kate Singer has been making connections globally and into Black studies and Caribbean studies from 18th century studies and Romantic studies for some time. And we're very grateful for the wider connections she's brought into the early Caribbean society. Désha Osborne is now at the University of Edinburgh. Her voice, commitment to ethical work in the Caribbean, to the lives of Indigenous peoples, has been a guiding light for all of us. I would like to thank the University of Winnipeg Research Office, who has generously funded this event, and the Bonnie Laird Speaker Series that is funding Professor Lawrence Hill tomorrow. I would also like to thank the University of Edinburgh Futures Institute, the Keith Shelley Association of America, which has generously funded, offered some funds, and also just been a wonderful supporter in terms of moral support, Mount Holyoke and Amherst. Finally, I want to thank all our speakers and panelists. We very much did this event in a slightly odd ad hoc manner. In a way, the form revealed itself as we went. And every single person who has joined with us has been patient, kind, generous, and entered into the ethical spirit of trying to build something together. I want to thank the artist Dreff for his mural in Belfast that has been on the logo of our programme. As somebody who went between Trinidad and the north of Ireland and went to school in Belfast, I love the fact that Equiano's own image from his frontispiece is peeking through between the buildings in Belfast, and that speaks to his global reach. I talk about that image more in the panel later on Black diasporic identity. The early Caribbean Society is a forum open to scholars of all nations and disciplines, committed to ensuring that the importance of the early Caribbean to global history and culture is remembered and continued. We are an anti-racist, anti-colonial organisation that includes and stands in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. Working as we do to remember the Middle Passage and Indigenous genocide since 1492, we are keenly aware that the same forces that devastated Equiano and his world, colonialism and slavery, settler colonialism and imperialism, are devastating our world today. We stand in solidarity with the Indigenous peoples of Palestine and their fight for liberation, and with the people of Haiti as they resist ongoing European invasion. We stand with the children of the Democratic Republic of Congo and with the people of Sudan, West Papua and Hawaii, and more. We deeply mourn the loss of over 200,000 Palestinian lives since October the 7th, and the shattering of many more lives in every way conceivable. We know we are speaking at a time of enormous trauma and catastrophe, and that we all have a responsibility not only to witness it, but to bring about the ending of the circumstances that are causing it. This event is a small attempt to honour and give our attention to the dispossessed, whose resistance and lives are the real site of anti-colonial struggle. I'd like to pass over to my colleagues now to add in anything for the opening. Désha.
Yes, thank you, Kerry. And I wanted to add to the list of thanks the person for whom this whole conference event was born out of, and that is you, Kerry. This would not have happened without your insistence and your perseverance and your forethought, and we are very, very, very grateful for you for that. And I just wanted to echo, as Vice President of the Early Caribbean Society, everything that you've said. And I'm sure Alex also agrees as well. So, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Wonderful. Okay, well, we're going to move on now to our roundtable with the four of us, where we want to think about the Caribbean, because we're the Early Caribbean Society and we've decided to have an event that considers Equiano as a site. And there are very specific reasons for that. Have a sip of tea. Just before we begin, there's one final little thing I want to say, which is that there hasn't been a crossword in the organising of this, and I'm not sure if that's a historic first in academia, but I'm just very grateful for the spirit in which everybody has worked together. Okay, can we share our slides? I'll share it. Yeah. Okay. Has everybody got a good view of the slides now? I'll move this to the side. The interesting narrative of Olaudah Equiano, an African, written by himself in 1789, was published at the height of the push for abolition in Britain and offered a much-needed first-hand account of transatlantic slavery and its many horrors. Olaudah Equiano, the wide-open O vowels, long, resonating and heavy in the Igbo language, open and end the name that Olaudah Equiano chose to give himself or returned to himself. These enact the very poetic and oralities of endless openings with the O that the interesting narrative on many levels performs. Now he tells us a favourite of heaven with a loud voice. Equiano's oralities resonate endlessly, connecting to the transoceanic geographies, Mamiwata, Oshun, Yamaya, across to Boca Chica of the Carrizo-Macrudo people, the Orinoco River, breaking open the pen of the barracoon and the slave ship's hold to an uncontainable everywhere without end. The interesting narrative is an unclassifiable text, sui generis, and it simultaneously engages multiple contemporary genres that were really only getting going: spiritual autobiography, travel more established, history, the picaresque novel, and more. It does this by also weaving into the British canon, Bible, the Milton's Paradise Lost, Shakespeare, and many more texts. None of these texts or cultures or genres remain quite the same after being put through Equiano's narrative processes that are proliferative, multivocal, destabilizing, plural, hybrid, and dialogic. Equiano's frontispiece with his opening also produces performance and ambivalence. Here he is, a visibly black man, proudly dressed in gentleman's clothing, with the Bible opened at the Acts of the Apostles in something of a challenging gesture. He looks at his reader with a deeply ironic glance that I feel always registers what a white viewer might be thinking about his person, and yet he is presented in a very English manner too. It is with this same irony that Equiano invokes Othello when he tells us to speak of me as I am. But thinking of Equiano, let me see, as a self-made man, or even Phyllis Wheatley, Peters as a genius, creates a false singularity. We're wanting to break open this idea of the individual that is constructed and selected by white academia and also white history. There's something quite eugenicist in it also that says this is the special person who rose above everything. Every life of the Middle Passage was precious. Equiano's opening chapter, Persona, moves between we and I, tells us about the communal lives that he led with his people. Equiano must leave behind so many, and he tells us about as many of them as he can. These are the lives that were never present in the Master's archive. The Black Atlantic, Paul Gilroy, 1993, serves as a framing concept for our conference, our event. As Gilroy says, the stereophonic, bilingual cultural forms originated by, but no longer the exclusive property of Black people, dispersed within the structures of feeling, producing, communicated, and remembering, I have heuristically called the Black Atlantic world. This world is political, geographic, cultural, and trans-temporal. It inverts all the norms of the Enlightenment world that underpin the slave and plantocracies Equiano fought. As Gilroy reminded us, the slaves' perspectives and positions provocatively suggest that many of the advances of modernity are in fact pseudo-advances, contingent on the power of the racially dominant grouping. That perspective brings us into the space that carries Equiano to the Caribbean and North America across the Middle Passage. As Ronaldo Walcott has noted when teaching Equiano, the Middle Passage, he says, tends to lie dormant for many students. Most of them I have encountered are not even familiar with this phrase. So the Middle Passage, this huge trade route that over hundreds of years transported 22 million, 11 million landed. These are approximate estimates, but these are the figures we work with. Huge loss of life. Cedric Robertson also calls out white historians such as Paul Lovejoy and others for how they write about, record, count, enumerate, and almost make into statistics all the people who were forcibly captured and crossed this Atlantic Ocean. What Ronaldo Walcott names as Caribbean creolization offers a way of sustaining ourselves to read the Middle Passage trauma as also resistance, survival, and creation at the same time as loss. And we can kind of see that in this watercolor here by Meynell, where people are clearly deprived, they're hungry, they are not clothed, but they are talking to each other, they are looking at each other. And so there is a world in the ship's hold. In this overwhelming context of silencing and erasure, how we teach, read, and remember Equiano and others matters. From the revelatory story he has to tell emerge powerful stories about origin, identity, place, legacy, and ancestry that remain vital for us today. How do we navigate all the many points that our Equiano's narrative opens out? How do we remain open to what Sylvia Wynter calls the new human species outside of colonial logics and formations? As Dion Brand writes in A Map to the Door of No Return, this doorway is an exit, not a point of re-entry. Can it be called migration? Quote, there is a sense of return in migrations, a sense of continuities, remembered homes. But the sense of return in the door of no return is one of irrevocable loss of those very things which make returning possible. This is from Grace Nichols, One Continent to Another. Child of the Middle Passage womb push. Daughter of a vengeful chi, she came into the world birth aching her pain, from one continent to another, moaning, her belly cry sounding the wind. We understand the Caribbean as the crucible of modernity, where the selves were made and unmade in racial capitalist formations. And we wish to place Equiano in the spirit of Caribbean Black radical traditions that argue against the Enlightenment versions of humanness to make new ones. As Edouard Glissant states, the belly of the boat dissolves you, precipitates you into a non-world from which you cry out. This boat is a womb abyss. It generates the clamour of your protests. It also produces all the coming unanimity. The boat is your womb, a matrix, and yet it expels you. This boat, pregnant with as many dead as with living, under sentence of death. We also think of Equiano's narrative as a decolonial text that tries to undo and end these very conditions of loss and death. In many ways, he anticipates the Caribbean intellectual tradition and the Black radical tradition. As Fanon tells us, decolonization never goes unnoticed. Against this loss, decolonization creates a new generation of men with a new language and a new humanity. Decolonization is truly the creation of new men. Equiano is a Caribbean decolonial Black radical, as well as an African man, as well as an Englishman, as well as a traveller, and everything else. In giving us Africa as an origin, he gives us Isaka, the village he was from, not as a place of race, but as an origin of story, and therefore of a new potential to make the new humanness that Fanon is talking about. Sylvia Wynter terms it the third event, as the origin of the human as a hybridly auto-instituting, languaging come storytelling species. That is what we can trace to the continent of Africa. Self-conscious, creative storytelling as part of our being is for Wynter what has been denied by the overdetermined Enlightenment form of mankind. Wynter's words here offer us a path back to the purpose of Equiano's storytelling as Blackness, as a way out of biological race, storytelling as a creative praxis, a future humanism that transcends the locked-in schema of his colonial oppressors. And Winter says, all of us share a storytelling or origin in which we are reborn. When Equiano tells us his story, he is not only saying, this is what happened to me, he is invoking an alternative humanism that is communal, transgeographical, Black diasporic, liberatory, and transtemporal to offer a riposte to the legacy of slavery and its lies. I'll pass over to Alex now.
Thank you, Kerry. Let me see here. Okay. Thank you so much, Kerry. And I just want to say, if anyone's having any problems accessing anything, just please let me know, because it's my job to make sure things work. And speaking of, I'm just looking on our YouTube live stream to make sure the right windows are showing, and they are. But anyway, thank you so much to Kerry, Désha, and Kate here. Thanks to you all, I've really had a broad education in Equiano, and where once I didn't think about him that much, now I think about him all the time. And I've also taken in most of the panels that we will be sharing with everybody over the next couple days, and it really is quite an education. And we're breaking boundaries. It's not just academics, it's writers, artists, and I really have all of you to thank for making that happen. So I'll say a few words and then pass it along. I have not stopped thinking about something I heard Nikki Hessel say actually at a Nasser conference, the Nasser Bars conference in Manchester at the site of Peterloo, which is where it was held. And she was responding to something someone else had said. And she said, she was talking about how thinking about history as something that is over and separate from ourselves is a very settler way of thinking, because it's a privilege to act and live as if the effects of colonialism are over. There is a sort of studied distancing scholars effect when approaching subject matter, as if being personally related to or personally affected by that which we study implies some sort of lack of objectivity. This is a pose I think we're taught to take as scholars in academia. As I have taken in many of the panels we will be experiencing together today and tomorrow, and as I contemplate Equiano's virtuosic output, I see how personal this subject matter is for all of us. He was nearly everywhere in his own time, and he continues to be everywhere in scholarly work, and he inspires the imaginations of many artists. We've used Dreff's image on it's painted on a building, and I would also say his ubiquity opens him to a problem, which is that Equiano can be held at a remove, made into a piece of evidence in support of someone's theory. He becomes a mascot for a project. His narrative was published 235 years ago, but it is a mistake to think we are so far in the future from his lifetime that we can pretend to affect scholarly distance from the subject matter. When we think about Haiti today, or Gaza, or even Springfield, Ohio, anyone remotely versed in colonial history inevitably must see, and therefore must admit, that we are still living out an extension of the white supremacist logic that governed the world in which Equiano traveled and wrote. In my own research, I study tourism, and I'm very interested in the transition of the Caribbean from a planter economy to a tourist one. And in tracking those touring Caribbean islands in the late 18th and early 19th centuries for leisure, rather than for the purposes of settling or economic interests. In the early 19th century, works written to describe the West Indies to fellow English readers began more to resemble those of John Murray, the hiker of the Alps, companion to Byron, and publisher of the handbook series that would define the guidebook genre. These books start to resemble more those of Byron than those of Murray than those of the early settler colonists who wrote describing the islands. One text I have been looking at is an 1804 book titled A Tour of the West Indies by Daniel Mackinnon, who lived from 1767 to 1830. Unlike Murray's tour of the continent, Mackinnon's route takes him past plantations and the docks where ships would anchor, having traveled the Middle Passage with trafficked Africans on board. In Mackinnon's description of the sites, we can see how easily the liberal subject can dehumanize and rationalize violence when it is in conflict with leisure. And yeah, we can pull up the slide. This quote is, horrific, but it's worth pausing on. For instance, he writes upon his arrival in Barbados, Mackinnon sees a ship that recently came in from Guinea. He writes, quote, here it is, a Guinea ship at a small distance with a cargo of newly arrived slaves who crowded to look through the portholes and hailed the sight of land with a chorus of wild and joyful music, which was singularly affecting to persons who knew how to sympathize with them in their emotions. There was certainly nothing in their looks that indicated despondence or apprehension. On the contrary, they were well pleased and seemed to anticipate an agreeable change of the situation. The ship which brought them over was clean and well ventilated, and they were treated with apparent mildness, unquote. And I think it's interesting to hear it's as if Mackinnon had a tour of the ship and could note its cleanliness. The main point of his observation here is really to congratulate the sort of person who would know how to sympathize with trafficked people, to note that maybe the Middle Passage was not so bad after all. He anticipates misery and despondence and shares his relief with his readers that he's not seeing any. Who is this meant to reassure? Who is allowed the full range of human emotions in this description? Contrast this with the beginning of chapter 5 in volume 1 of Equiano's narrative, in which he realizes that the ship in which he rides will dock in Montserrat. And this is the next slide. And this is the 13th of February, 1763. Quote, from the masthead we descried our destined island, Montserrat. And soon I beheld those regions of sorrow, doleful shades, where peace and rest can rarely dwell. Hope never comes that comes to all, but torture without end still urges. And this is from Paradise Lost. At the sight of this land of bondage, a fresh horror ran through all my frame and chilled me to the heart. My former slavery now rose in dreadful review to my mind and displayed nothing but misery, stripes, and chains. And in the first paroxysm of grief, I called upon God's thunder and his avenging power to direct the stroke of death to me, rather than permit me to become a slave and be sold from lord to lord. In this state of my mind, our ship came to an anchor and soon after discharged her cargo. I now knew what it was to work hard. I was made to help to unload and load the ship, and to comfort me in my distress in that time, 2 of the sailors robbed me of all my money and ran away from the ship. That's some of Equiano's noted sarcasm. I had been so long used to an European climate that at first I felt the scorching West India sun very painful, while the dashing surf would toss the boat and the people in it frequently above high water mark. Sometimes our limbs were broken with this, or even attended with instant death, and I was day by day mangled and torn, unquote. I am interested here in the quotation from Paradise Lost and what it points to, for just before these lines, the speaker describes what Satan views around him in hell, the, quote, dismal situation into which he and his horrid crew have fallen. What renders the scene all the more horrible to Satan is the, quote, thought both of lost happiness and lasting pain, unquote. Is Equiano finding sympathy with the plight of the fallen angels in this description? Is hell Montserrat and the years of enslavement unfolding in front of him? What does this mean about God and authority in general? Who is truly upholding the tenets of Christianity in this scene and morality in general? I also want to point to the physical distress in Equiano's account, which is throughout the narrative, for it seems to preclude the possibility of sounding a, quote, chorus of wild and joyful music, like the one McKinnon purportedly witnessed. The dashing surf breaks the limbs, causing Equiano to be mangled and torn, and even causes death. This all must have interfered with the musical celebration. The language which dehumanizes those who have been tortured by the middle passage continues now in the rhetoric used most recently by politicians in the United States describing Haitians fleeing the crisis in their country, and by those who fail to see the basic humanity of babies in camps in Gaza or doctors using pagers in Lebanon. No one here certainly is confused about the series of events that have created our current crisis across borders, but to see our current conditions as anything but a direct extension of the logic that governed Equiano's world is living out a dangerous settler logic, one that has no end but hell. So thank you very much. I've been learning so much, and I really appreciate this opportunity to share these thoughts. Are we turning over now to Désha? Okay. Désha Osborne.
I'll get your slides ready for you, Désha.
I have them here.
We have them. Okay, great.
Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. So following on from Kerry and Alex's brilliant remarks, and particularly, I mean, I'm very appreciative of the framing of this, because I'm going to speak to you a little bit about Paradise Lost as well. So I'm going to talk to you today about, in the spirit of pedagogy, and I think the framing of this event, one of the initial things that we spoke about, the four of us, was the afterlife of bringing together so many people from around the world to speak on how Equiano is still present, how Equiano has changed our kind of framing of history of enslavement, and also how do we reach out to students and colleagues and other scholars in that way. So in the spirit of all of that, I'm going to speak to you from a perspective of framing this as a resource. So I'm going to continue by highlighting three moments and aspects of the interesting narrative that have remained important for me as a teacher of this text, a researcher, and coming into this event. So what brings together each of these three are the ways in which Equiano creates a sense of diaspora in the Caribbean. And the slide you can see in the first slide here shows just gives you a visual of his movements, not just between that 3-year period where chapter 5 picks up, where he's sold to Captain Duran and then later on to Robert King, and then that leads to his self-liberation in 1766. But you can also see that the dates, his continual return to these islands. And the first point I'm going to take us to is actually a little bit before that, in chapter 4, when he's stationed on the Isle of Wight. And this is a scene where I spend a lot of time with my students because of his narrative placement. And the encounter, I think, equips him with an ontology necessary for surviving life as an enslaved person, and also the particular difficulties and harshness of the Caribbean in the 18th century. And it also provides a useful means to understand the forging of Black African diasporic community. This scene takes place when he's still under the enslavement of Captain Pascal. They are stationed, they're stuck, so to speak, on the Isle of Wight because, because of things happening in the 7 Years' War and also the death of King George II. And he talks to us about coming onto this the home of this gentleman. He tells us, I was one day in a field belonging to a gentleman who had a black boy about my own size. This boy, having observed me from his master's house, was transported at the sight of one of his own countrymen and ran to meet me with the utmost haste. I, not knowing what he was about, turned a little out of the way at first, but to no purpose. He soon came close to me, caught hold of me in his arms as if I had been his brother, though we had never seen each other before. After we had talked together for some time, he took me to his master's house, where I was treated very kindly. Equiano's clear, almost biblical language, and I want to draw your attention to how much this reads almost like a New Testament parable, also manages to capture the almost endless movement we find him throughout the text, and it will be noted, I think, in other panels throughout the next 2 days, how much he is constantly moving. If the young man hadn't anticipated Equiano's hesitancy, shifted with him, insisting on embracing him, this first moment of diaspora would not have occurred. His shifting and the young man, who surprisingly remains unnamed, his willful readjustment of his own movement are a symbolic recreation of that middle passage. The theme takes place in early 1761, and Equiano wants us to know that he hasn't quite grasped what was to further await him when he arrives in the Caribbean for the longest period a few years later. But this encounter equips him with, as I said before, an ontological framing necessary to survive. The differences between himself and this young man will always be present, just like all of the folks enslaved and free who he encounters throughout his journeys. But it is that difference is what brings them together. And for both, their embrace remains or becomes a mutual act of self-representation and the foundation for the formation of new identities. I just wanted to speak just very briefly on this, and I'm also glad that that Kerry included that painting by Maynell, the watercolor that shows the humanity of by humanity I mean the humanness of the individuals forced and captured on the slave ships. Because what Equiano was working with, what he was giving voice to, particularly in chapter 2, was images like this of the Brooks, like this stolen image disseminated amongst the population in London to show what the kind of reality of life on the Middle Passage was. The second scene is a moment of reflection that occurs in chapter 5, and Alex mentioned this just now, when Equiano first arrives in Montserrat after being sold to Captain Durand, following Pascal's, as he says it, his betrayal. Describing this as a new slavery, Equiano, this is one of those moments where we're very much aware of him drafting his experiences years later, being, having time to think about this. He finds entry into his emotions using a number of literary references, and chapter 5 is full of these, and perhaps the most prominent and recognizable come to us through Paradise Lost, John Milton's 1660 epic about the fall, about the angels and of heaven and of Adam and Eve. And it has remained perhaps one of the most important works in English since its publication. Equiano's narrative, nearly 130 years later, is among many works that pick up things, aspects of what Alex hinted at, which is how the anti-hero characters, particularly Satan and his fallen angels, are being used for various narrative purposes. Equiano makes 3 references from books 1 and 2. And the first comes to us, and I won't have to read that again, but I just wanted to draw your attention to this line 66, where Equiano replaces Milton's word never with rarely. And again, thinking about this in terms of his reintroduction back into Caribbean enslaved society, and he's choosing his words very carefully here. And other scholars have written about this, and I offer that word replacement to you here today as a continuation of Equiano's part in his relationship to the Caribbean and African Caribbean diaspora. In this literary sleight of hand, that change from, and I think that switch from never, which is Milton's word, to rarely, which is Equiano's word. The passage maintains, it still maintains the sense of foreboding, but also there's a bit of promise and a bit of hope still that still lingers. And again, I think this is speaking to us very strongly about how he's understanding his future and his present. He continues this a few pages further when he quotes from book 2. And again, he does another replacement. This time, he replaces Milton's past tense found in the line at the end of book 2, with shuddering horror pale and eyes aghast, they view their lamentable lot and find no rest. In Milton's, it was found no rest, they being the fallen angels. Which could be, and here again, I offer this is again his own literary sleight of hand, in which he is changing the past into a present indicative, and playing on the ambiguity of that word find. Right, find could be read as either a moment of discovery or an act of judgment. And he continues, and I'm not going to talk about the last quote, which comes also from book 2, in which I think I did. No, I did not. I did not include that. But the last quote, he speaks of. Oh no, I did here. Sorry. The last quote comes from again a part of book 2 as well, where he speaks about rebellion. I think this is also him looking back to the past, back to his own past, and thinking about what was how history is, as Kerry suggested earlier, is not separate. So this final quote comes from book 2, where he says, "No peace is given to us enslaved, but customary severe, and stripes and arbitrary punishment inflicted. What peace can we return but to our power, hostility, and hate? Untamed reluctance and revenge, though slow, yet ever plotting how the conqueror least may reap his conquest, and may least rejoice in doing what we most in suffering feel." And to this, I wanted to signal to what happened in Montserrat just a year, a few months even after he left, which is the 1768 rebellion. And this would have been the organization of this rebellion would have been happening while Equiano was there, and the main organizer was a man named Cudjoe. This rebellion was scheduled for March. So for the 17th of March of that year, based on the knowledge that the majority of the island settlers would be preoccupied with St. Patrick's Day celebrations, and the plot was discovered, and many of the leaders were executed. And I want to bring this into discussion because of the not quite hidden but often ignored frequency of attempts at rebellion and revolution that mark the history of the history of violent, destructive European presence in the Caribbean. Between the 1740s and the 1790s, nearly every island experienced an attempt at liberation, freedom, or autonomy for the enslaved or indigenous populations. And I just wanted to show you, while he was there, again, this just elaborates on that first slide about his presence, not quite elaborated on, not spoken about, but his physical presence in islands like what he called the Grenades and what we know now as St. Vincent, Grenada, and Grenadines. So all of these points converge in the final scene I wish to highlight that comes from chapter 10. And this is in Equiano's full conversion to Christianity. And I think there are elements of what Kerry and Alex were also saying here. And I won't have time to go into full detail on this entire scene, as it is the longest and covers nearly the entire first half of chapter 10, which begins with his feelings of spiritual emptiness. His spiritual journey has to that point been a primary way in which he framed his relationship to the world, the various worlds in which he inhabited. And in chapter 10, this culminates with the experience of John Annis. Equiano tells us that he has tried and often failed to lead a good Christian life based on his own personal interpretation. And this is where he includes a humorous quip about adhering to set 8 out of the 10 commandments. So that gives him a statistically good outcome spiritually. Yet he has entered thoughts of despair and even self-harm to the point where the sea has come to represent both sin and damnation. So for him, the greatest sin has become the sin of self-sufficiency. And these are his own words, meaning he believed his own strength brought spiritual comfort. He finds himself ultimately aligning with Methodism because of its meticulous self-examination in the pursuit of a devout life. So again, and with the most clear and strongest force, he uses, again, biblical language to reframe the capture, rebonding into slavery, and ultimate death by public torture of his friend, the ship's cook, John Annis, as analogous to the passion and death of Christ. The two scenes are presented in gory detail. And chapter 10, I invite all of you to revisit this because it's a very, very skillful and an expert way in which he's controlled this story, in which he begins with his spiritual kind of turmoil. Then he goes into the story of John Annis about the failed efforts of him and Granville Sharp to keep Annis in London. Then he goes into this, again, the gory details about the description, the method of torture that the Kirkpatrick family of St. Kitts has have suffered Annis to endure, and his ultimate death from the result of that torture. Then he abruptly ends that narrative, that part of the narrative, and then moves into, again, he picks up again his spiritual turmoil, and this time it results in this revelation, this vision that he has, and he describes here, I saw clearly with the eye of faith the crucified Savior bleeding on the cross on Mount Calvary. The scriptures became an unsealed book. I saw myself a condemned criminal under the law. I saw the Lord Jesus Christ in his humiliation, loaded and bearing my reproach, sin, and shame. So the extended scene culminates with his own vision of a crucified God and of himself as a condemned criminal under the law. By analogizing the image of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ to the horrors of slavery in order to simultaneously illustrate the strength of his Christian conversion and the humanity of African enslaved people. Equiano's analogy constitutes what Stuart Hall defines as the creation of the diaspora, of diaspora experiences of reproduction and transformation. And Equiano's final comprehension of and acceptance of Christianity is made through the image of Christ as slave at his crucifixion within John Annis's slave narrative. Just to quickly end what I wanted to say here, between chapters 5 and 10, we get these strong literary elements coming through, and it culminates with this poem that he himself has drafted and added, and I've only included here 8 of the 28 stanzas. But the very first stanza, I think, and the ninth stanza, I think, are perhaps the strongest, where he says, "Well, may I say, my life has been one scene of sorrow and of pain, from early days of griefs, days I griefs have known, and as I grew, my griefs have grown. Unhappy more than some on earth, I thought the place that gave me birth. Strange thoughts oppressed, while I replied, why not in Ethiopia died?" Then the poem ends with his reconciliation, a kind of expression of that it's a sentiment he shares about Ananis. Okay, I think I'm gonna move on to Kate.
Thank you, Désha. That was so amazing. I wanted to hear you talk for longer and longer, but it's been so great to hear all of your thinking about Equiano. I guess I just want to start by thanking Kerry, Désha, and Alex for being in the world and for giving your energy to all this tremendous work. I think but mostly your method has been, meaning your labor, has been like Equiano's, vulnerable, traveling and reaching seemingly disparate locations and people to gather them in community, but a different sort of community bound through the love that cannot but envision an anti-colonial world, and but also is bound in the looseness that allows for different flows and iterations of humanity. So I just want to offer two really small inflection points, two waves of reading that hopefully will speak back to Kerry's remarks on diasporic new humanity, to Alex's sense of white supremacist tourism, and Désha's, really like giving us these amazing visuals of Equiano traveling through the Caribbean while also kind of crafting these narratives that are moving from Miltonic, biblical, and kind of really reshaping them. But I just want to offer two little waves of reading that I think speak to how Equiano bespeaks himself as a varied subject living within himself and outside himself, in multiple diasporic lives in an environment where the Caribbean extends itself into the Arctic, as yet another seemingly terra nullius, and also as a diasporic subject that moves into the coastal Americas and Virginia and Savannah, themselves still colonies on the make. Equiano's narrative fluidity allows creolization to flow back into spaces of anticipatory whiteness, to place Black radicality and what Winter calls another genre of human, already at the sites of overdetermined humanity. At the start, and I just have two slides that I'll share. Sorry, to pause for a second. I'm not used to using PowerPoint anymore. Here we go.
Let's go to slideshow. Yeah, slideshow, and then from the beginning or from the current slide.
Okay, there we go. Sorry. Hopefully your brains liked that quick break. So at the start of perhaps one of the more surprising episodes in the interesting narrative, and this is in volume 2, when Equiano sets sail for the Northeast Passage through the glacial North Pole to India, he almost burns down his ship riding by candlelight. And the passage where he talks about this, I think is like pretty funny. And I think that it's an allusion to book 1 in Gulliver's Travels, where the Queen's maid is reading by candlelight and knocks it over and then sets fire to the house. And Gulliver then pees on it in order to stop the fire. And so I think that he is playing with that scene here, but in a much more serious way. in the sense that the penning of his narrative nearly sends up the entire empire-seeking ship in an allegory that serves to inflect a racial ethics into narratives of man-made apocalypse, the end of life as we know it, or what we have come to know as the Anthropocene. So Equiano is shifting Gulliver's kind of play with politics into this broader terrain of the man-made apocalypse of the Anthropocene, rather than the man-made apocalypse of 18th century royal skirmishes and politics. Equiano's writing is dangerous in its indictment of the necro-capitalism that institutes at once Black death and environmental destruction. Yet the narrative likewise makes literal the wrecking power of narratives upon material bodies, because Equiano himself would be immolated in the fire of his own narrative. Equiano is already answering critics of the white Anthropocene when these narratives do systematically grapple with the problem of Black suffering, as Axel Carrera has demanded, providing a historical narrative of the Anthropocene not entirely predicated on whiteness, as Catherine Yusof writes. So Equiano is already giving us this kind of Black Anthropocene that they're kind of saying may not exist in our current scholarship. In an ironic Gulliverian twist, Equiano's ship, the Racehorse, passes other ships. So it survives this almost fire, and then it passes other ships, like those named the Carcass, and gets stuck in the Arctic ice. So this is where this first passage comes from. Playing with bathos and hyperbole, as well as the small scale of the candle and the tectonic-like shifts of the deadly glacial ice, the racial capitalistic racehorse sails straight into a glacial whiteness that freezes it in place. So here I think he's playing with the quickness of and the avarice of racial capitalism, and he's playing that against the kind of also deadly, ubiquitous Arctic ice that represents or allegorizes a kind of slow and ever-present whiteness. Here too, Equiano's body is threatened with his only recourse, the white Christian pleas to eternity that ironically offer transcendence, which I think is one of Equiano's humorous Black parodies, that he's offered transcendence here, but transcendence equals bodily destruction. Here as elsewhere in the text, picaresque moments are strung together with an allegorical resonance so thick, it is as if he is parodying the entire use of coincidence within 18th century fiction and nonfiction. For there's really no break from repeated narrative events that coincidentally mirror each other, from the accrual of plots that invite Black brutality and death. It is, and so sometimes I think of this as Equiano is authoring the SNL skit where Trump wins and white people are shocked and think that there's a substantive difference in kind rather than degree between one candidate or another. That's my kind of, when I teach this is some of what we talk about in terms of how he's leveraging parody to speak so seriously. And kind of shrink the distance and also expand the distance between subjects of different socio-political valences. So I'm going to move to one last moment that I wanted to talk about to really open out another a scene. And so if Equiano is on the parodic trail of white humanity via kind of thinking about a Black Anthropocene, he's also thinking about the relation of gender in ways that echo and maybe shift Hortense Spiller's term of ungendering. In the muzzle scene toward the middle of volume 1, Equiano is shocked to find, and so he has been brought to Virginia, by the way, here. And so he is shocked as he is acclimated into this house. He is shocked to find the cook, quote, cruelly loaded with various kinds of iron machines. She had one particularly on her head, which locked her mouth so fast that she could scarcely speak and could not drink. Here again, we have shock and also absurd irony. The cook cannot eat. She could scarcely speak. And this double labor, or maybe it is actually a triple labor of woman's work and cooking and bodily breaking manual labor tied to technology. So those were the two I was thinking, but there's also a third kind of labor about the resistance to the silencing that's taking place in multiple ways here. So this kind of double or triple labor, which is akin to how I think Spillers talks about ungendering, is then placed next to Equiano's own labor as he is asked to fan an elderly enslaver. On the one hand, he is a figure of Black queerness here, that I think speaks to Greek pederasty, and there are other resonances of that throughout the narrative. It also speaks to or resonates with his close bosom relationship, laying in the arms of Dick, who dies young. And then the passage ends with a very queer Gothic moment where Equiano begins to fear the queer haunting of the patriarchal ghost in the painting. And I think that there's a lot we could talk about there. But on the other hand, as much as we want to maybe think of Equiano as a queer figure, like Spillers, Equiano is really asking us what happens to gender and sexuality in these scenes of subjection. How do these scenes indelibly change the way colonial subjects relate to one another? But how might they also provoke a new genre of human who must behave differently and must find new forms of relationality? Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for all those contributions. And we have some minutes now either to respond to any comments or include any thoughts from people who are listening with us, but also just to talk to ourselves a little bit more about some of the points from thinking about really what we did there was to show that the Caribbean is never unconnected, not only to other spaces, but to other ontologies in white literature or in travel writing that Equiano is constantly working through. And it really looks like from, grouping everything we've saying, the physical movement that you described, Désha, is also currently working intertwinedly with a sort of cultural journey. I wish there was a verb for describing what kind of reorganizing, reconstituting creative process is going on, even among the devastation. I don't know if anybody wants to pick up on any of that. It makes me think of comments about the Caribbean itself, of something like Derek Walcott's Nobel laureate speech, where he says, we have to pick up the shards of Caribbean culture and glue them together, but the lovingly put together vase is the Caribbean.
And not only that, the vase is stronger because it's been reinforced by what those shards are doing, right? It recreates something new, but it brings it together, but it creates something altogether new. And I feel like that for that scene with him and the young man on Isle of Wight really just encapsulates that there is within their kind of, it's almost like a dance, the way they're moving around each other and then suddenly coming together because there's like a recognition that something new has happened in this space. And I pause at that word countryman because I'm like, well, kind of trying to figure out what does he mean? Like which country is this? What does the country mean? Is it the same as what he would later use toward the end when he talks about nation?
Yes, exactly, because so many encounters he has, like the one with the poor woman loaded with irons, there is the white supremacy blocks that recognition and connection, where people are sort of segregated by the torments that they've been put through. But there are so many moments of others that he wants, that he's connected to, and then others like his sister and his mother, from whom he's taken.
Yeah.
So, the Caribbean is also that side of, especially for Winter and Gleason and many other writers, of loss, but a re-meeting, a new meeting place.
Yeah. Just to pick up on what you just said, Kerry, and what Kate said so eloquently about gender. His sister, when I teach Equiano, his sister is someone that we keep coming back to. I describe her as like having a kind of spectral presence throughout the entire text, especially in the moments where he's talking about women. Whenever he's speaking about the experience of a woman, I feel like he's kind of, what's the word? Like exercising or like evoking her. She is that symbol of woman, and what it means to understand that there is a unique experience that he's going to have, and one that women are having as well as separate.
Yeah, my students were, when we did this last week, we were talking so much about his mother and his sister, and they were struggling to try to figure out how to talk about it because he's not regurgitating 18th century sentimentality or sensibility. Um, but yet he feels this kinship with them, and there is such like affective flow like over the separation and over the barriers, and yet he's also not feminized either, in the sense that like that we might see in a different 18th century narrative. And so it was really kind of amazing to see them just try to just even try and talk about like how do we talk about gender or like relationality or intimacy there, that like we don't really have a language for what he's describing.
Yeah, and it's comparatively. With Kerry, one of your first slides, you mentioned all the other kind of the other writers who we think about, existing individually, and you're probably best to speak on Mary Prince, for example, and her experience, what she can and can't say, and as opposed to someone like Wedderburn who says the thing, or someone like Equiano who says nothing at all. I mean, you're muted.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I'm thinking of what Alex showed us, which are the sort of just the blunt lies of white supremacy that they have to speak through all the time. And I think this is where what we're trying to do, all of us, is to complicate ways in which Equiano is discussed. The way he's appropriated into existing white discourses. Yeah, you're right, Kit. He refuses the man of feeling. He refuses, and there's other models of the adventure that he knows. As soon as he stands in them, they're changed, like with his ironic glance, but that makes Alex's point about just the overwhelming weight of lies that they have to speak through, and how you can to even, find words to describe the undescribable is what he's constantly doing.
Yeah, to add to that, I was thinking about, because sometimes reading these accounts from these travelers, it gets very like disgusting in a way. It's very hard to read. I lost it one time at a conference because reading one of these passages out loud, and I was pregnant at the time, speaking of like affect, so I almost had to sit down because it's so nauseating. But I've been thinking about this in relationship to what are obviously overt lies about what this McKinnon witnessed, the constant harping on the truthfulness of Equiano's narrative, and how that's become a fixation that becomes a sort of main topic about Equiano, whereas the lies of white supremacy that we see everywhere don't receive that same treatment. And that's what I was, as I was rereading these McKinnon passages, trying to pick one, that's what kept occurring to me, is like no one's putting him up to the mirror and asking, oh well, is this true? Did this really happen? So I just wanted to say that. And also thinking about Equiano's sister, just the sheer physicality of his descriptions of what goes on, her being bound, and then the horror of family separation. Again, it's that rehumanizing of what often becomes dehumanized in white accounts of the material. Désha, go ahead. Oh, you have your hand up. Well, you're mute.
No, I didn't mean to have my hand up. Just one short question, Alex. And this is just kind of personal. Is McKinnon Scottish?
I was just wondering that, and I'd forgotten to look it up, but I was thinking, oh, Désha's going to want to know if he's Scottish. So I'm going to look that up because I was just wondering that myself. I knew you were going to ask me that. I'm just going to look.
But I think, as you said also, Alex, that this is so pertinent for today's, the sort of discourses haven't really shifted much, nor have the analytical tools. And that's really what we're trying to do here. Kate also drew on Winter. We're trying to shift Equiano, maybe let us say, out of white historiographical hands in many ways and into other hands, because there's just the binaries, truth, lies, black, white. None of these positionalities exist at one point, and yes, Désha, these individuals managed to write or to find a way to get their texts out, but any one of the people that they encounter or speak for could have had a story. They all had a story.
And that's one of the remarkable things about his book is the amount of stories. Some people get named, some people don't. And once you enter into the paratextual, and we find him in newspapers, for example, how he's added his name to lists with other Black men or Sons of Africa or whatever group he was kind of in the moment with. We forget about all the men like Thomas Cooper or
Yes.
I think Thomas Jones, or along with him and Equiano, who were telling these stories, who were sharing narratives, who were giving voice to people.
Yeah, he was in the community with all those people, and then at the same time, he had to sit down with people like John Newton, who had captained slave ships, and the white abolitionists. And I mean, I think that's something that Mary Prince can't convey, but we can sort of see that pressure of
Yeah.
being. I think Lawrence Hill, who will be talking later in his book, The Book of Negroes, really conveys Aminata's sort of almost physical overwhelm at just being surrounded by white abolitionists who want her to make them look good. And I think that Equiano's used today in scholarly work for quite similar reasons in some cases. As I think one of you said, as a mascot, I think Alex was the word that you used. And one thing we want to do with our event is to place him back into a bigger community, a much, much bigger community.
Yeah, and not it, in Spanish, mascota means your pet. So
Right.
I was thinking of that when I used that word deliberately. Just to Désha, McKinnon was the younger son of Scottish, I have a Scottish family, and they had holdings in Antigua, so I'd forgotten that. But yeah, and they received some considerable payouts after
Right.
slavery was abolished, like so many.
Well, I think what we'll do is I wonder if we have one slide that we wanted to look at just before we go. Has anybody got it there? The very last slide on.
But do we have any questions? Is that it? Do we have any
And do
comments?
you have any questions?
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, there's one last. Does anybody have the?
And I think I can share it.
Thank you. I've lost the run of my multiple.
You mean the very last slide?
Yeah. Because one of the things we've all been talking about since we've been organizing this, we've had so many things we wanted to say and probably not enough time to say them all. But hopefully we've gestured towards the directions we would like to invite people to think in. And yeah, after going all around the Caribbean and all around the world. At the very end, Equiano, the one place he's not allowed to go back to, which is also ironic when we think of the anti-Haiti discourse right now, is he's not allowed to go back to his home. He was not allowed to go back with the project to Sierra Leone. There's a I don't know what that is. Anyway, this is yeah, great. A lot of people read this last passage as Equiano almost a white capitalist who wants to carry on a sort of Smithian trade. But I think if we take on board a lot of what we've been saying, and certainly the idea of the Haitian Revolution, is that this is an alternative to racial capitalism at the very end. If Black people were permitted to remain in their own country, they would double themselves every 15 years, and then we would have a manufacturing industry, cotton and indigo grow spontaneously. The whole plantation economy that's being established is unnecessary, and that we can supply the world. And I think this is, we're seeing Burkina Faso, Niger, and other African countries trying to take back from France and Britain the resources that have been extracted under plantation racial capitalism and return it back to the people. And I think I want to argue that we can look at this as a sort of decolonial land back argument that could be extrinsic to the racial capitalist world that Equiano has laid out for everybody. I just don't know if anyone of you wants to add to that or say anything more about this. What he shows us in the Caribbean is a world of plantations, and what that requires to keep going, the kind of suffering that's needed, and none of it's necessary. All of it's a choice to maintain the powers of white supremacy. So yeah, we can maybe stop sharing now and see if we have any comments, and if not, we can.
That word grow spontaneous, or those words grow spontaneously, are pretty interesting too, in the way they indict settler colonialism.
Right. Exactly. The natural abundance of Mother Earth and of indigenous land and peoples working together is, he's showing that racial capitalism manufactures false scarcity, and kills lots of people. This whole thing of the population argument is not a Malthusian argument. It's a stop. Could you stop genociding us, please? We don't have to have labor, doesn't have to be captured. So I feel that's so important, because I feel that's one of the points where Enlightenment disciplinary readings of Equiano's text can shunt him back into those contained spaces. And what we're all trying to do in our different ways is to use Equiano in the Caribbean as a site for unsettling those boundaries. Okay, well, I think we can pause, and we will reconvene at the top of the hour, 11 a.m. EST, for Professor Deborah McDowell's keynote talk. Thank you.
Thank you. And just a reminder, it will be the same link. So
okay, well, shall we stay on this link?
We could just stay.
I'm gonna yeah.
Yeah, we could just stay, and
whoever needs to go can leave, and whoever needs to stay can stay.
And I'll stop the recording and the live streaming for now. So.